Columbia County has an opportunity to express its feelings, its remembrance, to give honor and pay tribute to what happened a year ago today. Our next speaker is Jeannie Metler, and she is the town supervisor from the beautiful community of Copiague, and is an attorney who has long fought for justice. For 30 years she was in practice in Westchester. Her roots in Columbia County go back through the generations of her family. Her grandfather was a farmer here more than 100 years ago. Her father was a well-known veterinarian, her mother a journalist. And with everything that Jeannie does, she brings passion and compassion to it and a real sense of social justice. So Jeannie, please.
Good evening. As I stand here today, I'm thinking back just 1 year. I remember sitting in our living room, watching the TV, watching the Congress in session, thinking at last we were on the verge of a rebirth of democracy. And at 1:30, okay. And at 1:30 that afternoon, on January 6th, then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said, "Voters, the courts, and the states have all spoken. They all have spoken. If we overrule them, it would damage our republic forever." And we listened, and we thought that the tide was finally turning, and we thought that the republic would be saved. And instead, as the speaker sat down and the cameras flashed to the outside, we saw mobs, not coming to save this country, but to tear it down. As each wave came and passed yet another barrier, I heard the so-called expert commentator on TV respond confidently, "Don't you worry, they will not get any further. They will be stopped." Again and again he intoned, "Don't worry, they will not get any further." But each time he said that they would not get any further, they did. First they climbed over flimsy barriers. Then they vaulted up stone walls. They crashed into glass doors and broke windows and invaded the virtual temple of democracy. And then, like clowns, they cavorted through the statutory hall. They broke into the chambers of the Senate and the House. They carried Confederate flags in the most sacred halls of our nation. It was redundant when they smeared feces on the walls. That night, just after 8 p.m., Vice President Pence reopened the Senate, and Mitch McConnell then said, "The United States Senate will not be intimidated. We will not be kept out of this chamber by thugs, mobs, or threats." We know the rest. We know that indeed Biden was sworn in January 20th. But we also know that since that time, the Republicans in Washington have suffered from amnesia, nourished by their desire for self-preservation. January 6th has become, in their telling, just another day in January. I keep thinking back to that commentator who kept saying, "Don't worry, they won't get any further." But they did. And now we are afraid that their attack on the Capitol was just a dress rehearsal and no one is stopping them. Because the thugs, as Mitch McConnell called them, still believe that the election was stolen. They still believe that the COVID numbers are false, and they still believe that vaccines are going to poison them. The first casualty of war is truth. And we are in a war to save this nation, to save this democracy, But the fact that half the country believes one set of facts and the other half believes something else entirely is not just a casualty of war, but is indeed the cause of this war. As we gather to remember and mourn what took place 1 year ago, and indeed as we mourn so much of what has happened since January 6th, we are all too aware that this democracy is fragile. Voting rights are under attack. Boards of elections are threatened. Our democracy is backsliding. It is not hyperbole to fear that democracy will not survive. And the question is, what can we do? All of us are activists. All of us care deeply. Many of us are in local government. What can we as individuals do? We can insist that Congress passes the Voters' Rights Act. We can insist that not just the thugs who marched on the Capitol, but Trump and the other leaders who called them to action be prosecuted. We can insist that the committee to investigate January 6th complete its work and be heard. But also, each of us can take on the responsibility and the most sacred mission to stand up for this nation. To say out loud that democracy matters. Democracy has to be the top priority. Defending democracy has to be our primary obligation. We need to insist on free and fair elections. We need to insist on the rule of law. We need to challenge the Electoral College. We need to have the courage to re-envision the Supreme Court and the Senate. We must march whenever necessary. We must send checks where it will help. We must run for public office and speak truth to power. We must organize and we must write letters and we must vote like our lives depend on it. In a time when this country was more divided than it is today, Abraham Lincoln called on mourners at Gettysburg to be, quote, dedicated to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. Let us dedicate ourselves to that unfinished work today.
Thank you, Jeannie. All of you are standing up for democracy tonight, and I wish it was just tonight, but we know that there's a long road and fight ahead of us. But democracy necessitates our constant supervision, our constant vigilance, and it has been said that it's a participatory sport. And that's true, that it really takes all of our focus, all of our attention, all of our efforts to ensure that we maintain a nation of laws, that no one is above the law, that we live in a country of freedom and democracy where every person has a vote. It's now my pleasure to introduce Sam Hodge, the recently elected chair of the Columbia County Democratic Committee. Sam is an attorney. He was a prosecutor. He worked in the Bronx DA's office for 7 years, engaged in very important work, and now is on the legal counsel for New York University and resides in Claverick. So Sam, we welcome you, and I think Sam is also going to have some great suggestions for us.
I want to begin first by, I want to begin first by thanking Brenda Geveritz. She was the lead organizer on this, and she's done an incredible job bringing all of us together for this important event. On a cold, gray day in January, our country teetered on the brink of authoritarianism. Our democracy was held captive by insurrectionists and extremists. Our president sought and encouraged the end of the American experiment. As we watched in horror as insurrectionists brutally attacked the men and women charged with protecting our capital, we all feared for our democracy. Those images were haunting. That policeman trapped in the door as rioters pushed, and he screamed because he was dying or because he might die. Today is a day for reflection. It's a day for somber remembrance. But it's also a day to celebrate our democracy, to celebrate our perseverance, to acknowledge that our country has and should always be an example to the world. The struggle for our democracy was and is not confined to our nation's capital. Across the country, we saw Republicans peddle lies and perpetuate conspiracies. In state after state, Republicans made concerted efforts to usurp the will of the voters. In case after case, their claims of fraud were discredited and dismissed. For more than 2 months, an overwhelming number of Republican leaders and elected officials refused to acknowledge that President Biden had won the election by 81 million votes. With each passing day, the Republican Party gave credibility to the ludicrous and absurd claims made by our former president. They were cowards. On January 6th, insurrectionists threatened to murder Speaker Pelosi, and they set up gallows to hang Vice President Pence. Yet 147 House Republicans, many of whom fled into the depths of the Capitol for safety, returned to vote to overturn the 2020 election results. They were cowards. American history is defined by figures who seek to make a more perfect union, by leaders who recognize injustice and strive to make our country more just, by activists who reach for the ballot so every voice in our democracy can be heard. There are few leaders left in the Republican Party. Since the election, Republicans have made a concerted effort to weaken our democratic norms in the service of partisan gain. They have passed restrictive voting laws to make it more difficult for people to vote, especially those in minority communities. The Republican Party has turned itself into a cult of personality, an organization with one aim: to take power, whatever the cost. We've seen the cost of those efforts here. Just this week, Republicans on the Board of Supervisors, dissatisfied with the results of an election, severed an entire division from the sheriff's office. Democracy is fragile. It has to be protected and nurtured, not just in Washington or Albany, also right here. Democracy works when we put country over party, policy over personality, freedom over tyranny. Now, on another cold, gray January day, we gather to ensure that what happened 1 year ago is not forgotten and will never be repeated.
I just want to acknowledge our new sheriff, Don Crack, and he's here. And Jackie Salvatore is here, under Under Deputy Sheriff. And I believe Mayor Kamal Johnson is here as well. So thank you. As you go home this evening, we hope that you will pledge to help get out the vote, help to ensure that every person has the right, every citizen has a right to vote, and that we continue to safeguard our democracy. It is a solemn occasion. It's also an opportunity for us to renew our commitments to the pursuit of liberty and justice for all. The French philosopher Camus said, "I should like to be able to love my country and still love justice." I think of those words and they propel me forward, and I am so pleased to have your participation and to know that we are in this together. So thank you all for coming out this evening, and get home safely, stay well.